Failure. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't carved into walls, but it existed in the air, like dust floating in a thin beam of evening light. You couldn't always see it, but you felt it settle on your skin. It lived at the dinner table, right there, between the salt shaker and my untouched report card. The house itself felt heavy that night. A narrow suburban home with beige walls and family photos arranged in perfect symmetry. The hallway displayed framed milestones, my brother's science fair medals, his varsity jacket, acceptance letters embossed in gold, every frame polished, every memory curated. And then, there was mine, a single school photo tucked in the corner, slightly tilted. It was raining outside, the kind of slow, steady rain that makes the world feel paused. Droplets tapped against the kitchen window in irregular rhythms. The yellow overhead light flickered faintly, humming like it was exhausted from witnessing too much disappointment. My father sat at the head of the table, posture straight, sleeves rolled precisely to his forearms. His fingers tapped once against the wooden surface before he unfolded the paper in his hands. My exam results. My mother sat beside him, hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles had turned pale. She didn't look at me. She stared at the table, as if eye contact might break something fragile. "You tried your best," she said softly. Her voice was gentle, almost apologetic, but my father cleared his throat. That sound, it was a warning. "It always was, and your best isn't enough." The sentence didn't explode. It landed quietly, controlled, surgical. My fork slipped from my hand and hit the plate with a sharp metallic clink. The sound echoed longer than it should have. Stared at the wood grain of the table, tracing invisible lines with my eyes. If I looked up, I might see it, that expression, that familiar blend of frustration and embarrassment. "Your brother got into Stanford," my father continued, his tone steady, measured. "You can't even pass basic economics. Stanford." The D word felt like a spotlight, bright, blinding. My brother wasn't at the table that night. He was already away, already succeeding, already becoming the story my parents proudly told at gatherings. I was the comparison, the cautionary tale. My hands trembled under the table. I curled them into fists to stop the shaking. My chest felt tight, like the air in the room had thinned. Failure. They didn't scream it. They didn't have to. It was in the way my father folded the paper carefully, not angrily, but decisively. It was in the way my mother's shoulders sagged, as if she had expected more and prepared herself for less. It was in the silence that followed. That silence was worse than yelling, because yelling at least means you care enough to react. Silence means you've already decided. I wanted to say something, anything. I wanted to explain that I froze during tests, that my mind worked differently, that I saw patterns in systems, flaws in logic, possibilities in chaos, just not in textbooks. But excuses sound weak when you're already labeled, so I said nothing. Dinner ended quietly. My father stood first, carrying his plate to the sink, with mechanical precision. My mother reached for mine, but I stopped her. "I'll do it." She hesitated, then nodded. The rain outside intensified. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The house creaked softly, old wood shifting with temperature. Somewhere down the hall, my parents' bedroom door closed. A low murmur of conversation followed. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. Failure doesn't just describe you. It reshapes how you see yourself. I replayed every moment that led here. The missed assignments, the half-understood lectures, the way teachers praised my effort instead of my talent. I thought about my brother's graduation ceremony, the applause, the camera flashes, the pride glowing on my father's face. I had stood in the crowd clapping harder than anyone, because if I couldn't be the success, I could at least be supportive. But lying there in the dark, something shifted. It wasn't anger, it was clarity. If I stayed, I would always be the comparison, always the almost, always the disappointment, sitting at the edge of the frame. Around 2 a.m., I got up quietly. The hallway felt colder at night. The trophy frames reflected faint moonlight, casting distorted shadows along the walls. I paused in front of them. My reflection appeared faintly in the glass beside my brother's awards. 2 faces, 2 futures. One favored. I walked into my room and pulled a small duffel bag from under the bed. The zipper sounded louder than it should have. I froze, listening. No movement. I packed quickly. A few clothes, my old laptop, the notebook where I sketched strange business ideas no one had ever taken seriously. I hesitated before grabbing one more thing. A photo. Not of trophies. Not of achievements. Just a childhood picture of all of us at the beach. Before grades. Before expectations hardened into identity. I slipped it into the side pocket. Standing in the doorway of my room, I looked back once. The bed neatly made. The desk stacked with books I never quite mastered. This room had watched me shrink slowly under pressure. The house was silent as I stepped into the living room. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. Each second felt like a countdown. I didn't write a note. Because what do you say? Sorry I'm not enough? Or maybe, I'm going to find out if you're wrong. I opened the front door carefully. The hinges creaked slightly, like a protest. The rain hit my face immediately. Cold, sharp, real. For a brief second, I considered turning back, apologizing, trying harder, becoming smaller. But then I heard it again. Not from them, but from inside my own head. Failure. If I was going to carry that word, I wanted it to be on my terms. I stepped onto the wet pavement. The streetlights reflected in puddles like fractured gold. The world felt wide, uncertain, unforgiving, but it also felt free. As I walked away from the only home I had ever known, fear crept in, heavy, immediate. Where would I go? What if they were right? What if I really wasn't enough? The door behind me didn't open. No one called my name, and somehow, that hurt more than anything they had said. I kept walking. Each step away from that house felt like stepping into darkness. But sometimes, darkness isn't the absence of light. It's the beginning of something unseen. And what they didn't know was that the boy who left in the rain that night would one day return with something they never expected. Not revenge, not anger, but proof. And the silence they once used against him would eventually belong to him. The city didn't care who I was, and for the first time in my life, that felt like mercy. New York in late October was not romantic. It was steel and steam and sharp wind slicing between buildings. Taxi horns collided with sirens. Subway brakes screamed underground like metal grinding against metal. No one slowed down. No one looked twice. No one asked about my GPA. No one compared me to my brother. No one labeled me. I arrived with one duffel bag and a stubborn silence I carried like armor. The bus station smelled of diesel fuel and stale pretzels. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting everyone in a tired yellow glow. People moved with purpose. I moved with uncertainty. But I moved. My studio apartment was barely bigger than my childhood bedroom. 4th floor, no elevator. The hallway carpet was permanently stained, patterned with dark spots that told stories no one wanted to hear. Inside, the air smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet soaked in years of other people's failure. The radiator clanged violently at night, like it was arguing with itself. I dropped my bag on the thin mattress and sat down. The springs groaned, in protest. This was freedom. Raw, unfiltered, unimpressed. At dawn, I loaded trucks at a distribution warehouse in Queens. The sky would still be dark when I arrived, breath visible in the cold air, steel doors rolling open with a metallic thunder. My supervisor, Frank, barely looked at me the first week. "Keep up," he'd mutter. That was the closest thing to encouragement. Boxes cut into my palms. My shoulders burned. Sweat mixed with dust until my shirt clung to my back like regret. But every time exhaustion crept in, I reminded myself, no one here expected greatness from me. They expected labor, and I could deliver that. At night, I cleaned office buildings in Midtown, marble floors, glass walls, conference rooms that smelled like expensive cologne and ambition. I vacuumed beneath tables where million-dollar decisions were made. Every elevator mirror became my confession booth. I'd catch my reflection in the polished steel doors, eyes tired, jaw clenched. Maybe they're right, I'd whisper under the hum of fluorescent lights. Maybe I am a failure. The word followed me across state lines. It didn't dissolve in the city air. It adapted. But something strange happens when you have nothing left to lose. You stop fearing embarrassment. You start observing. One night, near midnight, I was assigned to clean the 27th floor of a venture capital firm. The office was quiet, unusually so. Most employees had already left. Only the city lights outside remained, glowing through floor-to-ceiling windows like a galaxy pressed against glass. The conference room door was half open. Inside, the whiteboard was still covered in diagrams, flowcharts, arrows, bullet points. Circled in red, market inefficiencies, data lag, logistics bottleneck. The handwriting was rushed, aggressive, as if someone had argued passionately before storming out. I stepped inside. The carpet muffled my footsteps. The air smelled faintly of dry erase marker and espresso. I should have vacuumed and left. Instead, I stared, because for the first time in my life, I saw something they didn't. Not just the diagrams, the gaps. They were discussing supply chain optimization for mid-sized companies. Their solution was complex, expensive, overbuilt. I tilted my head slightly. Why design for giants when smaller businesses are drowning quietly? My heart began to pound, not from fear, but from recognition. This wasn't about grades. This wasn't about test scores. This was pattern recognition, systems thinking, the way my mind always worked. just never inside classrooms. I walked closer to the board. My fingers twitched, resisting the urge to grab a marker, a flaw in the system, and maybe a crack in destiny. Footsteps echoed faintly. In the hallway, I froze. The glass door reflected my silhouette against the city skyline. For a second, I saw myself the way my father might have. Janitor uniform, mop in hand, failure. The door handle shifted slightly. I grabbed the vacuum and switched it on quickly. The loud mechanical hum filled the room just as a tall man in a navy suit stepped inside. He looked irritated, mid-40s, sharp jaw, eyes scanning the whiteboard like it had personally offended him. He barely acknowledged me. "Almost done?" he asked, distracted. "Yes, sir." He walked toward the board, studying it again. I watched from the corner of my eye. His fingers tapped the marker against his palm. Impatient. "They're overcomplicating it," I heard him mutter under his breath. Before I could stop myself, the words slipped out. "Maybe it doesn't need to be built for the top." The vacuum hummed. My voice felt too loud in the silence between cycles. He turned slowly. "What?" I swallowed. My pulse pounded in my ears. "Smaller firms," I continued carefully. "They don't need enterprise-level integration. They need modular systems. Cheaper, faster." The room felt smaller. He studied me, not with contempt but curiosity. "And you know this because I've been invisible long enough to observe everything. Because when you're underestimated, you listen more than you speak. Because," I said evenly, "inefficiency scales differently at different levels." Silence. The city lights flickered outside. A siren wailed somewhere far below. He didn't smile, but he didn't dismiss me either. "What's your name?" he asked. I hesitated. For years, my name had been followed by comparison, by expectation. Now it felt like something new. I told him. He nodded once, then looked back at the board. Interesting. Just one word, but it didn't sound polite. It sounded considered. He left the room without another sentence. I stood there, breath shallow. What had I just done? Overstepped. Risked. My job, confirm their judgment or open something. The vacuum's hum faded as I switched it off. In the reflection of the window, I saw the skyline stretching endlessly into darkness. New York still didn't care who I was. But maybe, just maybe, one person had started to wonder. And sometimes, in a city that doesn't notice you, being noticed once is enough to change everything. It started as scribbles on napkins, not in a sleek office, not in a startup incubator filled with glass walls and motivational quotes, but in a 24-hour diner on 8th Avenue, where the coffee tasted burnt, and the neon sign outside flickered like it couldn't decide whether to stay alive. I sat alone in the corner booth most nights after my cleaning shift. The vinyl seat was cracked, the table slightly uneven. Outside, taxis splashed through rainwater pooled along the curb. Inside, a tired waitress refilled mugs without asking questions. That's where the idea took shape. A data optimization platform for small logistics companies. Affordable, adaptive, smart, not built for giants, built for the overlooked. The way I felt. I didn't have investors. I didn't have connections. I didn't have a LinkedIn network ready to applaud a bold announcement post. What I had was time carved out of exhaustion. YouTube tutorials played quietly through cheap earbuds as I balanced my laptop between coffee cups. Library Wi-Fi became my lifeline. I memorized the rhythm of the public library's closing announcement, the polite but firm voice reminding everyone that time was up. Time was always up. Weeks blurred into months. My mornings still began at the warehouse, cold metal docks, the smell of cardboard and diesel. My hands developed tiny cuts from lifting boxes, thin red lines across my palms that stung when sweat seeped into them. By evening, I cleaned conference rooms where men in tailored suits debated market share, and, by midnight, I coded. The glow of my laptop screen lit the small apartment like a lonely lighthouse. The radiator clanged in uneven bursts. Sometimes the neighbor's television bled muffled laughter through the wall. Sitcom jokes I never quite heard the punchline to. My eyes burned from late-night debugging. Lines of code blurred into abstract symbols. Error messages felt personal. Syntax error. System failure. The words hit harder than they should have. There were nights I nearly quit. Nights when my fingers hovered over the trackpad, ready to close everything. Ready to admit that maybe ambition without pedigree was just delusion. That's when I'd hear it. My father's voice. Calm. Controlled. Final. You don't have what it takes. The memory would arrive uninvited. His silhouette at the kitchen table. Disappointment carefully disguised as advice. I'd lean back in my chair and stare at the cracked ceiling paint above me. Maybe he was right. Maybe intelligence wasn't. About patterns and instincts. Maybe it was about grades and credentials and polished resumes. But failure has a strange advantage. It makes you immune to embarrassment. When you've already been labeled the worst, there's no reputation left to protect. So I kept building. I sketched system architecture on napkins during lunch breaks, drew arrows between data nodes while sitting on overturned crates at the warehouse. My coworkers laughed once when they saw me writing formulas instead of resting. "What are you, some kind of genius?" one joked. I smiled faintly. If only he knew. The prototype began as a fragile skeleton. Basic dashboard, minimal interface, no aesthetic polish, just functionality. I tested it using public datasets, simulated shipping delays, artificial bottlenecks. The first time it crashed, I stared at the frozen screen for nearly a full minute. My chest tightened, my jaw locked. There it is, I thought. Proof. I restarted. It crashed again. I slammed the laptop shut. The sound echoed too loudly in the small room. My breath came in short bursts. Outside, sirens wailed somewhere in the distance, rising, fading, rising again. For a moment, I saw myself packing again, not leaving home this time, but leaving the dream, because quitting would be easier than proving them wrong. I opened the laptop again, slower this time, careful, one bug at a time, cause and effect, find the flaw, fix the flaw. Hours passed unnoticed. The sky outside shifted from black to deep blue. Morning crept in quietly, painting the edges of the window with pale light. And then, it worked. The simulation ran smoothly. Data flowed between modules without lag. The bottleneck resolved in real time. Processing speed improved by 37% in the test environment. It wasn't pretty. The interface looked like it belonged in 2009. Buttons misaligned, colors clashing, but it solved the problem. And that was enough. I leaned back slowly, afraid that even celebrating might break it. My reflection stared back at me from the darkened corner of the screen, eyes bloodshot, face thinner than when I'd arrived in the city. Not impressive, not polished, but determined. I whispered it out loud, just to hear it exist in the air. It works. The next step was scarier than coding: exposure. I compiled a list of small to mid logistics firms across the East Coast, companies that couldn't afford enterprise software, companies drowning quietly in inefficiencies no one glamorous wanted to fix. 143 emails, each personalized, each carefully worded to sound confident, not desperate. I hovered over the send button longer than I'd like to admit, because sending meant risking silence, or worse, rejection. I clicked. The emails disappeared into the digital void. The next days were torture. Every vibration of my phone triggered a surge of adrenaline. Most notifications were irrelevant. Spam promotions, shift reminders, bank alerts about my dangerously low balance. No replies. By the 5th day, doubt began whispering again. Maybe I overestimated the solution. Maybe I misunderstood the problem. Maybe the executive in the conference room had only humored me. The 7th day, I nearly deleted the inbox thread entirely. And then, at 2:17 p.m., while standing in the warehouse break room under flickering fluorescent lights, my phone buzzed. Unknown company domain. Subject line. Modular optimization. Proposal. My pulse spiked. My hands felt suddenly weightless. I opened it. Interesting concept. We've been struggling with delayed routing analytics. Are you available for a call this week? The room seemed to tilt slightly. The hum of vending machines faded. My breathing slowed, then quickened again. One reply. Out of 143. Only one. But, sometimes, one is all it takes. I stared at the message, rereading it over and over. Not because I didn't understand it, but because I needed to confirm it was real. A call, a chance, an opportunity to step out from behind the mop, the warehouse crate, the cracked apartment ceiling. This wasn't validation yet. It was a test. And that single reply would force me to confront a deeper fear. Not the fear of failure, but the fear of being seen. And this time, there would be no hiding behind silence. The email was short, 2 sentences, 9 words. Interesting concept. Let's talk. I read it 12 times. Not because it was complicated, but because it was fragile. Like if I blinked too hard, it might disappear. The warehouse break room around me smelled like reheated leftovers and industrial soap. A vending machine hummed in the corner, flickering fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. For months, silence had been my only reply. Now, someone wanted to talk. The meeting was scheduled for Friday, 3 days away. 3 days that stretched longer than the previous 3 months combined. I barely slept. Every scenario played out in my mind. They laugh. They dismiss me. They ask for credentials I don't have. They Google my name and find nothing impressive. No Stanford, no polished internships, no safety net. Thursday night, I laid my only blazer across the bed, navy blue, slightly worn at the cuffs, bought from a thrift store in Queens. It didn't quite fit, tight around the shoulders, sleeves a little short, but it was all I had. Friday morning arrived cold and sharp. The city wind cut between buildings like a blade. The glass tower where the meeting was scheduled reflected the skyline like a monument to ambition. Its surface mirrored clouds drifting across steel and sky. I stood outside for a full minute before walking in. The lobby was silent except for the soft echo of heels on marble. A chandelier hung overhead like frozen light. The air smelled faintly of citrus and money. The receptionist glanced at me, then at her screen. "You're here for the 10:30?" she asked. "Yes." She handed me a visitor badge without smiling. The elevator ride felt longer than it was. My reflection in the mirrored walls looked smaller than usual. Jaw tight, shoulders stiff, eyes alert. Maybe they're right. Maybe I don't belong here. The 34th floor opened into a wide corridor lined with glass-walled offices. Sunlight poured in from massive windows, casting sharp shadows across polished floors. A conference room waited at the end. Inside, 3 executives sat across a long table, 2 men, 1 woman, all impeccably dressed, all composed. Their expressions were unreadable. I stepped inside, placed my laptop on the table carefully, as if any sudden movement might shatter the opportunity. "Thank you for coming," the woman said, her tone professional, neutral. The tallest man leaned back slightly, fingers steepled together. "Why should we trust you?" he asked. Direct, clean, surgical. My throat dried instantly. I felt sweat gather at the base of my neck under the blazer collar. "Because I've been underestimated my whole life," I wanted to say. "Because I've studied problems while cleaning the rooms where you discuss them. Because I've had nothing but time to observe what you overlook." But emotion wasn't evidence. Instead, I turned the laptop toward them. I built this specifically for mid-sized logistics firms struggling with modular inefficiencies. I began, steadying my voice. "Not enterprise-level corporations. Companies like yours, smaller portfolio clients." I clicked into the demo, the dashboard. Loaded, clean, functional, not beautiful, but precise. "Your existing systems over-integrate," I continued. "They assume scale that smaller firms don't operate at. My model isolates data bottlenecks and recalibrates routing predictions without requiring full system overhaul." The room remained silent. "Numbers don't care about family opinions." Graphs appeared. Simulation data ran. Processing speed comparisons flashed across the screen. Halfway through the demo, something shifted. The CEO, the man who had seen me weeks earlier in the conference room, leaned forward slightly. His eyebrows rose, just a fraction, but I saw it. That tiny shift was everything. The woman beside him tapped her pen against her notebook, then stopped. The other man narrowed his eyes at the projection. "Run the delay simulation again," he said. I did. The system adjusted in real time. Red indicators faded to green. Predicted delivery windows recalibrated. Silence again. But this time, it felt different. Not dismissive, evaluative. "What's your background?" the woman asked. There it was. The question I feared most. "I didn't go to Stanford," I almost said. Instead, I answered honestly. "I've worked in logistics warehouses and observed inefficiencies from ground level. I studied system architecture independently. The design is built from operational reality, not just theoretical modeling." A pause. The CEO leaned back now, arms crossed. Not defensively, but thoughtfully. "You built this alone?" he asked. "Yes." "No team?" "No." He studied me carefully. Not my blazer, not my shoes. Me. I felt exposed, transparent, and strangely calm. Because for once, I wasn't being judged against my brother. I was being judged against the problem. The man to the left cleared his throat. "If we were to consider this," he said slowly, "it would start small." My heartbeat quickened. "How small?" I asked. "A pilot program. 1 regional client. Limited integration. Not applause, not investment, not validation. A test." The CEO nodded once. "We'll start with a pilot." The words landed softly, but they cracked something open inside me. Relief surged first. Then fear, because opportunity is heavier than rejection. Rejection is clean, final. Opportunity demands performance. "We'll monitor results for 90 days, the woman added. "If metrics hold, we discuss scale. 90 days, 3 months, to prove that I wasn't a fluke, that I wasn't lucky, that I wasn't the failure who stumbled into something accidental." I closed my laptop slowly, careful not to rush the moment. "Thank you," I said. My voice didn't shake this time. As I stood to leave, the CEO spoke again. "Interesting perspective," he said. "You see gaps others don't." I nodded, because I've lived in gaps. In the elevator ride down, my reflection looked different. Still the same thrift store blazer, same tired eyes, but something behind them had sharpened. The lobby doors opened, and the cold city air hit my face. Again, New York still didn't care who I was, but one door had opened. And doors, once opened, rarely close the same way. I walked down the steps of the glass building, heart pounding not from fear, but from responsibility, because now, failure wasn't theoretical, it had a deadline, and if the pilot failed, it wouldn't just confirm my father's voice, it would echo it. But if it succeeded, then the word that once lived in that kitchen would finally have to move out. The pilot turned into contracts. It didn't happen with fireworks. There was no dramatic announcement, no triumphant music swelling in the background. It happened quietly, in spreadsheets, in data reports, in numbers that refused to lie. 90 days, that was the deadline. For 3 months, I barely slept. My small apartment became a war room. Whiteboards leaned against peeling walls, covered in revised algorithms and recalibration models. Coffee cups multiplied like evidence of obsession. My laptop fan ran constantly, a low mechanical breath in the darkness. Every morning began with dread. What if the metrics dropped? What if the system failed under real pressure? The first week of the pilot, a regional client experienced a routing delay. A glitch in data syncing caused a temporary backlog. My chest tightened when the notification hit. This is it, I thought. This is where it collapses. I rushed to debug the system. Fingers moving fast, sweat forming at my temples. I patched the issue within hours, manually recalibrating the affected module. The client's operations manager emailed later that evening. Delay resolved faster than expected. Impressive response time. Impressive. I leaned back slowly. Not lucky, not accidental, impressive. By the end of the 90 days, the numbers spoke clearly. Operational efficiency improved by 32%. Fuel costs dropped. Delivery windows tightened. The CEO called me personally. "We're moving forward," he said. Full integration. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it now. Respect. Contracts followed, then more contracts. Word traveled faster than I anticipated. Smaller firms began reaching out directly. Referrals multiplied. The system scaled cautiously at first, then aggressively. Expansion turned into attention, and attention attracts predators. Investors began circling like hawks, curious, cautious, calculating. They invited me into offices larger than anything I'd ever stepped into, rooms lined with art that probably cost more than my childhood home. They smiled, often, but their eyes evaluated constantly. How defensible is your architecture? What's your burn rate? Are you replaceable? Replaceable. The word lingered in the air longer than the others. I answered carefully, calmly, not with arrogance, but with evidence. My company grew faster than I could emotionally process. I hired my first engineer, a quiet woman named Priya who challenged my assumptions without fear, then a data analyst, then customer support staff. Suddenly, there were payroll responsibilities, office leases, legal consultations. My days filled with meetings instead of code. The silence I once worked in disappeared, replaced by ringing phones and overlapping conversations. One afternoon, I stood in the center of our newly rented office space, exposed brick walls, large windows overlooking Midtown, and felt something unexpected, overwhelm. Success is loud, and loud things travel. Media mentions began appearing, small tech blogs first, then industry publications. A feature article titled, "The Modular Disruptor." My name printed in bold. I stared at it longer than necessary, not because I was proud, but because I was afraid, because every success echoed back to a kitchen table where I had once been called not enough. One evening, long after the office had emptied, I stood by the window watching the city lights flicker on. The skyline stretched endlessly, steel and ambition glowing against the dark. On my screen, quarterly revenue, 8 figures. The number didn't feel real. It felt dangerous. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. Hello? A pause, then a voice I hadn't heard in 7 years. "Mother, I saw something online," she said carefully, her tone measured, controlled. "Is it true?" The office suddenly felt smaller. "Yes," I replied calmly. There was hesitation in her breathing. I could hear the faint sound of dishes clinking in the background. The same kitchen, I imagined. The same overhead light. Silence lingered. 7 years of silence, compressed into a single breath. "Well," she continued, choosing her words like fragile glass. "Your father would like to talk. Would like. Not needs, not misses. Would like." I turned toward the window again. My reflection stared back. Sharper suit now, steadier posture. But inside, something younger stirred. The boy at the table. The boy who left in the rain. "What does he want to talk about?" I asked. Another pause. "He's proud," she said softly. The word landed awkwardly, as if unused. Proud. Where was that word when I needed it most? Outside, Traffic moved steadily below, life continuing. Unaware of the storm forming quietly in my chest, I imagined my father holding the phone, waiting, composed as always. Would he apologize? Would he justify? Would he pretend none of it happened? "I'm busy," I said finally. It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either. "We understand," she replied quickly. Too quickly. Another silence. "I'm glad you're doing well," she added. Not "I'm sorry," not "we were wrong," doing well, as if success was a weather report. We ended the call politely, controlled, civil. I lowered the phone slowly. For years I had imagined this moment differently. I thought it would feel triumphant, victorious, like winning a silent war. Instead, it felt complicated, because success doesn't erase memory, it amplifies it. The next morning, an acquisition inquiry landed in my inbox, a major firm expressing serious interest in discussing long-term strategic alignment. The numbers attached made my breath catch. This wasn't just growth anymore. This was legacy-level money. And suddenly, the phone call from my mother felt less like coincidence and more like timing. Because loud success doesn't just attract investors, it travels home. I stood alone in the office again that night, the city humming outside, my name glowing faintly on a glass door behind me. For the first time since leaving, I wasn't sure if I wanted to answer when the past knocked, because proving them wrong had fueled me. But what happens when they finally admit you were right? And as I stared at the skyline, phone resting heavy in my hand, I realized the next decision wouldn't be about money. It would be about something far more dangerous: forgiveness. The buyout offer came on a Tuesday. I remember because the sky that morning was a bruised gray streaked with early rain. It hit the windows of my office, casting long, diffused shadows across the polished oak desk. A single beam of light reflected off the edge of my laptop, as if pointing directly at the email notification. $52 million. I read the number twice, then 3 times. It didn't feel real. Not immediately. Not yet. My fingers hovered over the mouse, trembling slightly. A mixture of disbelief, fear, and the kind of exhilaration that comes once in a lifetime. The cursor hovered over the email, as if I could delete the number and wake up from a dream. The room felt smaller, not physically, but emotionally. Memories that had lived quietly in the corners of my mind all at once began pressing in. All those nights in the diner, scribbling. Algorithms on napkins. All those weekends hunched over a library desk, eyes stinging from fluorescent lights and exhaustion. All those whispered insults echoing through the silence at home. The words that weren't said but felt every day at the kitchen table. "You'll never make it. You're the dumb one. You're not enough." They were quantified. Now, $52 million. I pressed my palms against the desk, feeling the wood grain through my skin, grounding myself. I didn't jump. I didn't scream. Not yet. I just let the gravity of the number sink in, like standing at the edge of a cliff, waiting to fall. My board was already on the call, voices muted but urgent over Zoom. "This is life-changing," one said. "Take it," another urged. I nodded slowly. My mind raced, but not with excitement, with questions, not about money, but about everything it represented. All the late nights, the sacrifice, the doubt, the ridicule, all those moments. That shaped me. Could money erase them? No, not in a way that mattered. I clicked through the projections, the growth charts, the projections of revenue post-acquisition. The numbers were beautiful, elegant, perfectly rational, cold, like everything else they had ever valued. My eyes drifted to the window again. Rain streaked down the glass, running in thin rivulets. Outside, the city moved on, oblivious to the private storm unfolding in this high-rise. Taxis splashed through puddles. People passed in umbrellas, unaware that someone in this office was about to change a life forever. I signed the papers with steady hands. The pen scratched sharply against the heavy stock, a sound that echoed in the quiet room. My heart hammered, not with excitement, but with tension. The gravity of crossing this threshold settled in like a physical weight. The wire transfer confirmation arrived the next morning. Ding. I didn't celebrate immediately. Instead, I sat in my chair, staring at the reflection of my own eyes in the laptop screen. Bloodshot, tired, yet sharper than ever. The numbers on the confirmation screen were more than digits. They were a map of survival, of proof, of defiance. And then my phone buzzed again. "Father." I didn't hesitate. I answered. "I was hard on you," he began. No apology, just a statement. Hard. That was his word. Cold, measured, calculated. I let the silence stretch, let it hover in the space between us. The kind of silence that held weight, that demanded reflection. That reminded me why I had left in the first place. Outside, the city rumbled. Car horns, rain tapping on the roof. the faint whir of a helicopter in the distance. The room felt alive, yet the moment between us was frozen, timeless. I could feel the tension coil in my chest, all the old anger, the bitterness, the unspoken words. Every memory of being overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed crowded around me. The boy who had once packed a bag in the middle of the night to escape a house full of disappointment was staring up at the man who now called. The same house, the same family, the same voices that had once defined failure. And then I said, something he never expected. "I'm coming home." The words hung in the air, heavier than the money, heavier than the company, heavier than years of silence. I could almost hear the weight of them pressing against his chest through the phone line. There was a pause, long, uncomfortable, reverent almost, and then a subtle shift in his tone. "Home," he repeated. Not a question, not a statement, just the word, echoing, almost fragile. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes for a moment. The rain outside had stopped. Light began to filter in through the clouds, soft and pale. I could hear the city breathing, indifferent, but somehow aligned, with me in this moment of reckoning. I remembered the small duffel bag I had packed all those years ago, the damp night, the flickering kitchen light, my father's silhouette in the doorway, silent. I had left with nothing but resolve. Now I was returning with everything, not just the money, not just the company, not just the success they had doubted existed, but with proof that every insult, every dismissal, every moment of quiet humiliation had been building toward this. Proof that I had survived, that I had won, that I had become more than the labels assigned to me. I stood up and walked toward the window. The city stretched beneath me, endless streets, lights, and possibilities. I felt the pulse of life below, matching the pulse within me. The wind brushing against the glass was like a whisper, a reminder of all the nights I had spent alone, dreaming, coding, planning, surviving. The phone buzzed again. Father. This time it would be a different conversation, a conversation that could not undo the past, but could finally acknowledge the present, a conversation that might heal, or at least confront, years of distance. I placed the phone gently on the desk. I picked up my coat, paused, took a deep breath. I'm coming home. And this time, I wasn't running. I was walking toward everything I had once been denied, toward confrontation, toward reconciliation, toward the house that had once defined failure, but now awaited acknowledgement. The city outside seemed to lean closer, listening, as if aware that the story was finally coming full circle. Every street, corner, every puddle, every passing cab, insignificant individually, but together, the world felt alive with the anticipation of what was about to unfold. Because $52 million wasn't just money, it wasn't just validation, it was the tangible, undeniable evidence that even silence and scorn could be overcome. That leaving hadn't been the end, that coming back could be a beginning. And as I stepped toward the elevator, feeling the weight of the past, the thrill of the present, and the uncertainty of the future, I realized something profoundly simple. Success is loud, but courage is unstoppable. I pressed the elevator button, and as the doors began to close, I whispered to myself, barely audible over the city hum, "Let's go home." The house looked smaller, or maybe it wasn't smaller. Maybe I was taller, stronger, wiser. Perhaps the walls had shrunk in memory, condensed under the weight of years spent away, under the absence of the boy who had once fled through its back. Door. The paint was slightly faded, duller than I remembered, but not peeling. The trophies on the shelves, my brother's trophies, were still polished. Each one gleamed under the soft yellow light of the hallway, as if untouched by time, proof that someone in this house had always succeeded effortlessly. His photograph still dominated the center of the hallway, smiling, confident, a snapshot of everything I had been told I would never be. I felt the old familiar pang of envy and inadequacy, but this time it was muted, controlled, observed rather than internalized. Mother opened the door first. She looked smaller too, or perhaps just frailer. Her eyes searched my face as if she were trying to locate the boy she had once reprimanded for dreaming too big, for being the failure. They lingered on. We stepped inside together. The familiar creak of the floorboards greeted me like an old ghost. Dust motes floated in the sunlight slanting through the windows. The air smelled faintly of old wood polish and vanilla from some leftover candle, just as it had always smelled. The house felt like a memory, alive, waiting, expectant. We sat at the same kitchen table. The yellow overhead light flickered slightly, casting shadows on the walls lined with framed photos, a visual history of a life that had continued without me. Same table, same light. But the dynamic had shifted, the power had shifted, and I was acutely aware of it. Father cleared his throat, a sound that had always meant authority, expectation, judgment. "We heard about the sale," he said. His eyes didn't meet mine fully, but they lingered enough to acknowledge my success. I nodded. "You did well," he added. "Not 'I'm proud of you,' not 'I missed you,' just 'you did well.'" The words were lukewarm, but they carried the weight of years of unspoken acknowledgement. I reached into my briefcase, placing it deliberately on the table. The soft leather squeaked slightly as I set it down, the sound loud in the quiet kitchen. Father's brow furrowed subtly. Mother's hands twitched. Curiosity flared in the shadows of their eyes, but it wasn't what they thought. Not a check, not a gift, not a confession, not a plea for reconciliation. It was a document outlining a condition, terms, decisions, my terms, my control, my way. Father leaned forward slightly, the old instinct to dominate flickering in his posture, but tempered by something new, uncertainty. "You brought this here?" he asked. The words were more cautious than accusatory, more curious than commanding. "Yes," I said, calm, controlled, each word precise, deliberate, each pause measured, because some things don't change unless boundaries are drawn, and I've learned a few things while away. Mother's lips pressed together, a faint nod, a sigh escaped, almost unnoticed. Recognition, perhaps, or resignation. Opened the document slowly, sliding it across the table. The reflection of the yellow light danced on the paper's edge, glinting like a weapon. "This," I said, "outlines the buyout distribution, how the company's assets will be managed, the future of what I built, what I accomplished, what I won without asking for permission, without your approval." Father's eyes narrowed slightly. He was processing, calculating, his fists unclenched. Slowly, on the table. "This is legal?" he asked. "Yes, fully legal and fully binding." A tension settled over the room like a storm about to break. For years, he had been the one to define limits, to control narratives, to dictate what was possible, and now I was setting the limits. I was dictating the narrative. The air between us crackled with this reversal of power, unspoken and raw. Mother finally spoke, her voice soft, cautious. "You don't want anything from us?" I looked at her, at him, the room, familiar yet alien, stretched before me. I shook my head. "No," I said, "not in the way you think. Not in validation. Not in approval. This isn't about reconciliation. It's about clarity. It's about boundaries and respect. The kind I never got before." Father's jaw tightened. He leaned back, silent for a moment, long enough to make the air feel heavy, like fog over a harbor. Then he exhaled sharply. "Boundaries," he muttered, almost to himself, almost unsure if he was testing me. "Yes," I replied, my eyes steady, my tone unwavering. "Boundaries. For the first time, everyone knows the rules. The house, the company, everything. It's clear, and if those rules are broken, there are consequences. Not just for me, but for everyone." Silence fell, heavy, dense, thick enough to feel on my skin. My pulse thumped in my ears. The rain had returned outside, a soft tapping against the windows, the familiar sound of life moving forward despite the tension. Mother reached out, almost instinctively, resting a hand lightly on the table, a gesture so small, yet so human, that it drew a flash of warmth across my chest. Recognition, acknowledgement, a tentative truce. Father studied the document again. The edges, the clauses, the numbers, the meticulous detail of someone who had worked in silence, sweat, and solitude for years to define what mattered most. And for the first time, I saw a flicker of something behind his eyes, something unreadable. Perhaps pride, perhaps fear, perhaps both. I stood slowly, letting the weight of the moment settle. The house felt smaller still, but differently now, less constrictive, less oppressive, more mine in some sense. "You've built something," he said finally, voice low. "Something you couldn't have done here." I nodded. No response needed. The acknowledgement hung in the room, unspoken yet heavier than any word. I packed the briefcase, lifting it carefully, deliberately, the leather warm under my fingers. I walked toward the door, the hallway, the trophies, the familiar scent. All of it lingered like a memory, a museum of what was and what had changed. Mother's eyes followed me. Father's arms remained crossed, the past and present colliding silently. I paused at the threshold, looked back once. The boy who had left, the man who had returned, all existing in the same space for a fleeting moment. And then I stepped out, not to prove them wrong, not to seek approval, but to reclaim the power that had always been mine, quietly, patiently, through persistence, through struggle, through victory. The house remained behind me, smaller in stature, yes, but monumental in memory. And for the first time in years, I felt free, because home wasn't about walls or trophies. It was about knowing who you had become and letting them see it on your terms. And they finally did. The quiet click of the front door closing echoed, like a punctuation mark, a full stop. A new chapter had begun. It wasn't a check, not a gift, not a repayment, not a symbol of wealth or success to display, not the kind of thing that could be framed or photographed for social media accolades. No, this was something different, something heavier, something that would linger in the air between us like a charged current, waiting to be noticed, to be acknowledged, to be understood. The house was quiet. The familiar hum of the yellow kitchen light overhead felt almost sacred, almost deliberate. The faint scent of coffee and vanilla lingered in the corners. My mother's hands rested on the edge of the table, her fingers slightly trembling, betraying a nervous anticipation she refused to voice. My father, as always, stood back, arms crossed, posture rigid, the lines of his face drawn in the same careful angles they had always been. Yet there was something different in their eyes today. Curiosity, caution, confusion. I opened my briefcase slowly, deliberately, letting the weight of the moment fill the space. The hinges clicked softly, a small but audible punctuation mark in the thick silence. Inside was a stack of documents, crisp, pristine, and immaculately bound. The top page caught the light, its edges gleaming faintly under the yellow glow. Their eyes followed every movement, tracking each deliberate action. Mother's breath hitched slightly. Father's jaw tightened. I placed the document on the table. It wasn't a check. I created a program, I said, calm, measured. My voice carried across the kitchen, each word deliberate, as if it were a stone being placed carefully on a fragile structure. For students labeled as underachievers, for kids who are told they're not enough, who are told failure is their destiny before they even understand what that word truly means. Mother's hand trembled more noticeably. She reached out, hovering just above the document, as if unsure whether touching it would break the fragile tension. Father shifted slightly, uncomfortable, his rigid posture betraying a subtle insecurity. His eyes darted between the document and me. His silence was deliberate, the kind of silence that had dominated my childhood, that had defined so many dinners, so many conversations, so many expectations unspoken but felt. I know what that does to someone, I continued quietly, eyes fixed on the pages, voice steady, but heavy with emotion. I know what it feels like to be constantly underestimated, dismissed, told you're not capable. I lived it, and I don't want anyone else to live it the same way. The air felt denser with each word. Their confusion deepened. The questions they wanted to ask were tangled in their throats, muted by the weight of my calm authority. They could sense that this was not just about me, not about proving a point, not about money, not about success. This was about justice in its quietest, most powerful form. I wanted you to see this first, I said, sliding the document closer to them. My hands lingered, resting briefly on the edge of the table, as if to offer reassurance, as if to show that there was no malice, only purpose. Father leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing, scanning the text, his lips pressed together, the corners twitching almost imperceptibly. Mother's fingers rested lightly on the table, hovering but not touching, her knuckles white from restraint. The document outlined scholarships, mentorship programs, partnerships, with schools in underprivileged areas and grants for children who had been written off too soon. Every clause was intentional, every word chosen with precision. Every detail reflected a life lived in the margins, a life that had learned to survive, to observe, to build quietly in the shadows until the moment was right. The gravity of the gesture seemed to press down on them. For years, they had held the power to define success, to determine worth. Now, they were faced with something that didn't require their approval, didn't rely on their permission, and didn't validate their earlier judgment. For the first time in my life, he had no words, and silence, once my punishment, once the echo of, "Yes," I said, "I have, and it's only the beginning." The rain outside had started again, soft and steady, tapping against the window like a quiet celebration. Each drop seemed to punctuate the moment, as if the world itself acknowledged the significance of what had been set in motion. I closed the briefcase slowly, deliberately, letting the leather click shut with a finality that resonated deeper than any check ever could. For the first time in years, the weight of judgment, the echo of dismissal, the lingering shadow of inadequacy had no place here. Silence had changed sides, and in that silence a quiet victory bloomed, not loud, not boastful, not fleeting, permanent, intentional, transformative. The room held its breath, so did I, and in that shared, unspoken understanding I realized something profound. Sometimes the most powerful statement isn't spoken, it's built, it's designed, it's lived, and they were finally witnesses, not to a bank account, not to a title, but to the real measure of worth, impact, resilience, and the courage to create change where none was offered. For the first time, I didn't need approval. I had already changed everything, and they finally knew it. Later that night, Father knocked on my old bedroom door. It was a soft, hesitant knock, barely audible over the low hum of the heater and the occasional creak of the house settling. The walls, familiar yet distant, still carried the echoes of childhood arguments, whispered dreams, and the quiet suffocation of expectations. I hadn't seen him like this in years, tentative, uncertain, vulnerable. I didn't answer immediately. The air in the hallway felt thick, weighted by unspoken words. The faint glow of the hallway light cast elongated shadows across the floorboards, stretching like fingers reaching for the past. I could hear his breathing, uneven, careful, measured, the sound of a man confronting something he had long avoided, the reflection of his own failures in the mirror of his child's life. I was afraid, he admitted finally, voice lower than I had ever heard it, carrying the kind of tremor that comes from confronting guilt you've carried for decades. I stayed silent, letting the words hang in the doorway between us, heavy and insistent. Of what? I asked quietly, almost a whisper. The words felt fragile in my mouth, like they could shatter if spoken too loudly. That you'd struggle, that you'd fail, he confessed, his hands visible now, shaking slightly as they hovered near the doorknob. I thought, pushing you, demanding more, it would protect you. I didn't see you. I saw my own fears. The admission struck me with unexpected force. It wasn't an excuse, not really. It was a crack in the armor he had worn for decades, a window into the complexity of a man I had long judged as rigid, unfeeling, even cruel. And yet, vulnerability rarely arrives fully formed in someone like him. It's gradual, tentative, almost painful to witness. I studied his face in the dim light. Time had aged him differently than me. Lines etched deeply across his forehead, the gray at his temples, the slight droop at the corners of his eyes. All whispers of mortality, reminders that he too carried the weight of life's disappointments. His jaw, once set in unwavering certainty, now flexed with indecision. Sometimes parents project their fear as pressure, I said slowly, letting the words come gently, deliberately. Fear doesn't build strength, belief does. He swallowed, audibly, and for a moment it seemed as though the world itself had paused. The hum of the heater, the soft creak of floorboards, the distant rumble of traffic outside, all of it faded into silence, replaced by the gravity of the conversation taking place. Belief. That was the word that lingered. That was the invisible bridge I had built for myself, step by step, in the absence of encouragement, in the shadow of doubt. I had learned it the hard way, through long nights of struggle, moments of humiliation, and the slow, quiet accumulation of small victories. You did it anyway, he murmured, voice thick with something like awe, regret, and relief all at once. Even when I couldn't believe it. Yes, I replied, my tone calm but unwavering. Even when you couldn't, even when no one could. That's how belief works. You build it for yourself, brick by brick, in the moments no one else notices. Watched him in the dim glow of the hallway light. His shoulders, once rigid, seemed to slump slightly, as though carrying the weight of realization. His eyes, searching mine, betrayed a conflict I had never seen before. Pride mixed with guilt, love mixed with inadequacy. He took a cautious step into the room, the floorboards creaking softly beneath his weight. Each movement seemed deliberate, tentative, like a man walking on fragile ice. I didn't move. I let him come to me on his own terms. He started, then stopped. The words faltered, dissolving into the silence that had defined so much of our relationship. I could feel the hesitation, the fear of opening a door that had been closed for far too long. I didn't offer answers. I didn't need to. Sometimes, simply listening, simply allowing space for confession, is enough to start the healing process. You were always stronger than I gave you credit for, he finally said, voice barely above a whisper. I see it now, and I'm sorry. For the pressure, for the doubt, for everything I couldn't understand. I felt something shift in the air. The tension that had long hovered like an invisible ceiling between us seemed to lift, if only slightly. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was acknowledgement, recognition, a quiet, fragile beginning. I had to build my belief alone, I said softly. And I did. That's why I can stand here today, not because of the pressure, but despite it. Not because you pushed me, but because I found my own strength. His hands trembled again, this time more from emotion than fear. He stepped closer, finally closing the small distance between us. The hallway light illuminated the gray streaks at his temples, the slight droop of his eyes, and the subtle tremor in his hands. These were marks of age, of experience, of humanity, and suddenly, I saw him not as an antagonist in my story, but as a flawed man, trying imperfectly to reconcile with his own limitations. I didn't realize, he admitted quietly. I thought I was helping. I thought the pressure was protection. I see now, it was fear. Yes, I agreed. Fear can motivate, but it can't nurture. Strength comes from belief, from the quiet conviction that you are capable, even when no one else is watching. We stood in silence for a long moment. The hum of the heater returned, the faint creak of floorboards beneath our feet, the distant sound of the city at night filtering through the window. But the silence now was different. Heavier, yes, but lighter at the same time. Charged, yet peaceful. Attention transformed into understanding. Father's voice broke the quiet again. I wish I had seen it sooner, and I wish you had believed sooner, I replied, tone gentle. But we can't change the past. We can only build the future. He nodded slowly, a gesture of tentative acceptance, of acknowledgement, of a first step toward repair. His hands, still trembling slightly, hovered near mine, not touching, but close enough to bridge the emotional distance that had spanned years. You built yourself, he said finally, voice quiet, reverent. And now, I see it. Yes, I said, voice firm yet calm. And I'll continue to build, not for approval, not for recognition, but because belief transforms everything it touches. He exhaled slowly, finally, releasing a breath I could almost see. A burden lifted, a weight acknowledged, a fear faced. For the first time, our roles shifted. He was no longer the gatekeeper of approval, no longer the architect of my doubt. He was simply a father, confronting the truth of his own limitations, and beginning quietly to understand. I stepped aside slightly, allowing him space. The room, once filled with echoes of judgment and silence, felt alive now with possibility. Not resolution, not closure, but potential. The kind that grows slowly, nurtured carefully, into something enduring. Thank you, he said finally, voice trembling, for letting me see it. I nodded. You don't have to understand it. Just witness it. He remained for a long moment, absorbing the weight of the statement, the reality of the quiet victory that had unfolded before him. And then, finally, he stepped back, leaving the doorway slightly ajar, a symbolic gesture that spoke volumes, more than words ever could. And in that small, quiet space, I realized something essential. Sometimes, the belief you build alone doesn't just shape your life. It transforms the way others see themselves if they're willing to look. And, tonight, he was finally willing. Silence returned. But it was no longer oppressive. It was contemplative, reflective, a gentle reminder that even the most fractured relationships can begin to heal when fear gives way to belief. And in that moment, alone but together, I understood. The hardest lessons, the heaviest burdens, are not broken with confrontation. They are transformed with understanding and belief. Belief had finally won. 6 months later, the foundation launched. The morning air in the city was crisp, sharp, carrying the faint tang of rain from the night before. Streetlights glimmered on wet asphalt, reflecting like tiny promises in puddles. I arrived early, the hall quiet except for the low hum of electricians, testing lights, and the soft murmur of last-minute staff preparations. Hundreds of applications had poured in over the past months, stories of doubt, of rejection, of being labeled not enough. Each one carried the same weight I had carried for years, a mirror of the silence that once filled my own home. Inside the main hall, banners fluttered slightly in the air-conditioning breeze. Belief beyond labels. Tables were set meticulously, chairs aligned perfectly, microphones tested and retested. The polished wooden floor reflected the overhead lights, creating a pristine, almost surreal atmosphere. My heart thumped against my ribs, a rhythm that reminded me that even victory carries tension. I glanced at the applications once more before the launch began, letting their words wash over me. Names, stories, handwriting so raw and unfiltered, pain, hope, desperation, and resilience all rolled into one. Faces blurred as I read, but the emotions were unmistakable. I remembered the nights I had doubted myself, the echoes of my father's disapproval, the whispered comparisons to my brother. Each application was a testament that no child should endure what I had endured, that potential can exist even when unseen, even when ignored. The cameras clicked as journalists moved into position. The staff coordinated final instructions with sharp precision. The room buzzed with energy, but for me the moment was quieter, charged with something deeper than publicity. It wasn't about recognition or applause. It was about justice in its most subtle, transformative form. In the front row, my parents had taken their seats. I noticed them only when the hall began to fill. My mother sat stiffly, hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. Father's jaw was tight, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. Both carried the weight of unfamiliarity, the tentative anticipation of people encountering someone they thought they knew, someone who had grown into a life beyond their understanding. The lights dimmed slightly, a hush falling over the room. As the MC began to speak, when my name was announced, there was applause. Cameras flashed, recording every movement, every expression. But my eyes, trained to focus on a single detail after years of careful observation, went directly to my parents. Father didn't clap immediately. He stood slowly, deliberately, as if testing the muscles, testing the reality of the moment. I could see it in the slight furrow of his brow, in the way his eyes softened imperceptibly, the first hint of comprehension, of acknowledgement, of understanding that failure had never defined me. Mother's hands trembled lightly as she rose, not with pride, at least not the kind that can be spoken, but with recognition that the child she had quietly underestimated had created something tangible, enduring, and meaningful. The applause swelled around me, but I barely heard it. My mind replayed the years in flashes, the kitchen table with my exam results, the unspoken comparisons to my brother, the nights of doubt, the long hours of coding and planning in empty apartments, the countless rejections. Each memory felt heavier in that instant, but heavier with a sense of triumph I had never expected. When I stepped onto the stage, the microphone cool in my hand, I didn't speak of revenge. I didn't speak of proving them wrong. Instead, I spoke of belief. I spoke of potential, of the children whose stories had arrived in my inbox, stories that reflected my own struggle. My voice carried across the hall, steady, deliberate, filled with the authority that comes from lived experience. "We are here today not to celebrate me," I said, letting my gaze sweep the audience. "We are here to celebrate the belief that exists within every child, the potential that cannot be measured by grades or expectations, the courage it takes to rise despite doubt, despite labels, despite silence." There was a pause. The room absorbed the words, the weight of their meaning settling into the audience's consciousness. Cameras captured my gestures, the small movements of hands emphasizing conviction, the slight forward lean into each sentence, the calm strength in my stance. Father shifted in his seat. The initial stiffness in his shoulders softened, and for the first time, his eyes reflected genuine understanding rather than judgment. He had spent years projecting his fears, shaping his expectations around control, and yet here, in this hall, he finally saw something he had never truly grasped. My self-made strength, my resilience, my vision. Mother's eyes glistened. Not with tears, exactly, but with a recognition that words could not capture. She leaned slightly forward, as if drawn into the story, into the moment, into the undeniable proof that the child she had once doubted had transcended the narrative she had imposed. I concluded my speech with a reflection that carried the room into quiet contemplation. "Failure was never my identity," I said softly, deliberately, letting the weight of each word land. "It was their misunderstanding. And sometimes, the loudest victory isn't revenge, it's silence, the kind that no one can ever use against you again." Applause erupted again, louder this time, but I felt removed from it, observing it as an echo rather than the purpose. My parents stood fully now. Their claps were not just acknowledgement of the event, of the cameras, of the success on paper. They clapped because they understood, finally, subtly, undeniably. I could see the internal shift, the quiet reconciliation in their eyes. This was not about reconciliation with them, exactly, but about demonstrating that triumph is often silent, often unseen by those who once doubted you, and yet undeniable in its impact. As the launch event continued, media personnel moved closer for interviews, and staff coordinated the distribution of scholarship materials. I took a moment to step back. The hall was alive with energy, laughter, conversation, footsteps echoing off polished floors. Yet the stillness of personal triumph lingered in my chest. The applications continued to arrive digitally, hundreds more than anticipated. Each story, each narrative, was a reminder that the foundation's purpose extended beyond me. The work I had created was now a vessel for others, a shield against the very doubts that once threatened to define my life. I glanced at my parents one last time before leaving the stage. Father nodded, a simple motion, but layered with understanding. Mother smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly, but the depth of emotion was unmistakable. For the first time, they were witnesses to the power of belief and to the transformation that silence and perseverance can create. The foundation was more than an organization. It was a statement, A declaration that labels, doubt, and comparison could be transcended. That children who were told they were not enough could grow into architects of opportunity. That the loudest victories are often unseen by those who once doubted, but felt profoundly by those who persist. And as I left the hall that night, the city lights reflecting in puddles like miniature stars, I understood fully. This was the moment when the past finally fell silent, when belief triumphed over fear, and when the quiet power of achievement became undeniable. Because sometimes the ultimate victory isn't in proving others wrong, it's in living beyond their understanding. And tonight, that victory was mine.